Born on December 30, 1935, the youngest of 12 children, Bongo served as a lieutenant in the French Air Force, then climbed quickly through the civil service, eventually becoming vice president of Gabon. He assumed the presidency December 2, 1967, after the death of Léon Mba, the country's only other head of state since independence from France in 1960. Bongo set up a one-party state. 6 years later, he converted to Islam and took the name Omar. Considered one of the wealthiest men in his country, his presidential security staff numbered 1,500, according to the U.S. State Department, while the entire military numbers just 10,000 troops. Bongo sought international approval, and in May 2004 he visited then-President Bush at the White House. He also tried to cast himself as a mediator, working to end conflicts in Chad and Central African Republic, where his country has a small contingent of peacekeepers. He passed away in 2009. At the time of his death, he was the longest-serving ruler in the world. Omar Bongo Ondimba, born Albert Bernard Bongo, December 30, 1935 to June 8, 2009, was a Gabonese politician who was the second president of Gabon for almost 42 years, from 1967 until his death in 2009. Bongo was promoted to key positions as a young official under Gabon's first president Léon Mba in the 1960s, before being elected vice president in his own right in 1966. In 1967, he succeeded Mba to become the country's second president, upon the latter's death. Bongo headed the single-party regime of the Gabonese Democratic Party, PDG, until 1990, when, faced with public pressure, he was forced to introduce multi-party politics into Gabon. His political survival despite intense opposition to his rule in the early 1990s seemed to stem once again from consolidating power by bringing most of the major opposition leaders at the time to his side. The 1993 presidential election was extremely controversial but ended with his re-election then and the subsequent elections of 1998 and 2005. His respective parliamentary majorities increased and the opposition becoming more subdued with each succeeding election. After Cuban leader Fidel Castro stepped down in February 2008, Bongo became the world's longest ruling non-royal leader. He was one of the longest-serving non-royal rulers before his death. Bongo was criticized for in effect having worked for himself, his family and local elites and not for Gabon and its people. For instance, French Green politician Eva Joly claimed that during Bongo's long reign, despite an oil-led GDP per capita growth to one of the highest levels in Africa, Gabon built only 5 km of freeway a year and still had one of the world's highest infant mortality rates by the time of his death in 2009. After Bongo's death in June 2009, his son Ali Bongo, who had long been assigned key ministerial responsibilities by his father, was elected to succeed him in August of that year. The youngest of 12 siblings, Albert Bernard Bongo was born on December 30, 1935 in Lwai, since renamed Bongoville, French Equatorial Africa, a town of the Otagoao province in what is now southeastern Gabon near the border with the Republic of the Congo. He was a member of the small Baik ethnic group. He changed his name to El Hadj Omar Bongo when he converted to Islam in 1973. After completing his primary and secondary education in Brazzaville, then the capital of French Equatorial Africa, Bongo held a job at the Post and Telecommunications Public Services, before joining the French military where he served as a second lieutenant and then as a first lieutenant in the Air Force in Brazzaville, Bangui, and Fort Lamy, present-day N'Djamena, Chad, successively, before being honorably discharged as captain. After Gabon's independence in 1960, Albert Bernard Bongo began his political career, rapidly rising through a succession of positions under President Léon Mba. Bongo campaigned for M. Sandaungout in Otagoao in the 1961 parliamentary election, choosing not to run for election in his own right. Sandaungout was elected and became Minister of Health. Bongo worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a time, and he was named Assistant Director of the Presidential Cabinet in March 1962. he was named director 7 months later. In 1964, during the only coup attempt in 20th century Gabon, MBA was kidnapped and Bongo was held in a military camp in Libreville, though MBA was restored to power 2 days later. Bongo became president on December 2, 1967. Following the death of MBA 4 days earlier, and was installed by de Gaulle and influential French leaders. Aged 32, Bongo was Africa's fourth youngest president at the time, after Captain Michel Mikomro of Burundi and Sergeant Nassing B. Ayadima of Togo. In March 1968 Bongo decreed Gabon to be a one-party state and changed the name of the Gabonese Independence Party, the Bloc Démocratique Gabonais, BDG, to the Parti Démocratique Gabonais, PDG. In the 1973 elections for the National Assembly and the presidency, Bongo was the sole candidate for president. He and all PDG candidates were elected by 99.56% of the votes cast. In April 1975 Bongo abolished the post of vice president and appointed his former vice president, Leon Mebiami, as prime minister, a position Bongo had held concurrently with his presidency from 1967. Mebiami would remain as prime minister until his resignation in 1990. In addition to the presidency, Bongo held several ministerial portfolios from 1967 onward, including Minister of Defense, 1967 to 1981, Information, 1967 to 1980, Planning, 1967 to 1977, Prime Minister, 1967 to 1975, the Interior, 1967 to 1970, and many others. Following a Congress of the PDG in January 1979 and the December 1979 elections, Bongo gave up some of his ministerial portfolios and surrendered his functions as head of government to Prime Minister Mebiami. The PDG Congress had criticized Bongo's administration for inefficiency and called for an end to the holding of multiple offices. Bongo was again re-elected for a 7-year term in 1979, receiving 99.96% of the popular vote. Opposition to President Bongo's regime first appeared in the late 1970s, as economic difficulties became more acute for the Gabonese. The first organized, but illegal, opposition party was the Movement for National Restoration, Mouvement de Redressement National, Morena. This moderate opposition group sponsored demonstrations by students and academic staff at the Université Omar Bongo in Libreville in December 1981, when the university was temporarily closed. Morena accused Bongo of corruption and personal extravagance and of favoring his own Bait tribe. The group demanded that a multi-party system be restored. Arrests were made in February 1982, when the opposition distributed leaflets criticizing the Bongo regime during a visit by Pope John Paul II. In November 1982, 37 Morena members were tried and convicted of offenses against state security. Severe sentences were handed out, including 20 years of hard labor for 13 of the defendants. All were pardoned, however, and released by mid-1986. Despite these pressures, Omar Bongo remained committed to one-party rule. In 1985, legislative elections were held which followed past procedures. All nominations were approved by PDG, which then presented a single list of candidates. The candidates were ratified by popular vote on March 3, 1985. In November 1986 Bongo was re-elected by 99.97% of the popular vote. On September 24, 1965, he was appointed as presidential representative and placed in charge of defense and coordination. He was then appointed Minister of Information and Tourism, initially on an interim basis, then formally holding the position in August 1966. MBA, whose health was declining, appointed Bongo as Vice President of Gabon on November 12, 1966. In the presidential election held on March 19, 1967, MBA was re-elected as president and Bongo was elected as vice president during the same election. Bongo was in effective control of Gabon since November 1966 during President Leon Mba's long illness. On May 22, 1990, after strikes, riots and unrest, the PDG Central Committee and the National Assembly approved constitutional amendments to facilitate the transition to a multi-party system. The existing presidential mandate, effective through 1994, was to be respected. Subsequent elections to the presidency would be contested by more than one candidate, and the presidential term of office was changed to 5 years with a term limit consisting of one re-election to the office. The next day, May 23, 1990, a vocal critic of Bongo and the leading political opposition leader, Joseph Renjam, was found dead in a hotel, reportedly murdered by poison. The death of Renjam, a prominent business executive and secretary-general of the opposition group Parti Gabonais du Progrès, PGP, touched off the worst rioting in Bongo's 23-year rule. Presidential buildings in Libreville were set on fire and the French consul general and 10 oil company employees were taken hostage. French troops evacuated foreigners and a state of emergency was declared in Port-Gentil, Renjam's hometown and a strategic oil production site. During this emergency, Gabon's two main oil producers, ELF and Shell, cut output from 270,000 barrels per day, 43,000 m3/d, to 20,000. Bongo threatened to withdraw their exploration licenses unless they restored normal output, which they soon did. France sent in 500 troops to reinforce the 500-man battalion of Marines permanently stationed in Gabon to protect the interests of 20,000 resident French nationals. Tanks and troops were deployed around the presidential palace to halt rioters. In December 1993, Bongo won the first presidential election held under the new multi-party constitution, by a considerably narrower margin of around 51.4%. Opposition candidates refused to validate the election results. Serious civil disturbances led to an agreement between the government and opposition factions to work toward a political settlement. These talks led to the Paris Accords in November 1994, under which several opposition figures were included in a government of national unity. This arrangement soon broke down, however, and the 1996 and 1997 legislative and municipal elections provided the backdrop for renewed partisan politics. The PDG won a landslide victory in the legislative election, but several major cities, including Libreville, elected opposition mayors during the 1997 local election. Bongo was eventually successful in consolidating power again, with most of the major opposition leaders being either co-opted by being given high-ranking posts in the government or bought off, ensuring his comfortable re-election in 1998. In 2003, Bongo secured a change in the constitution allowing him to seek re-election as many times as he wanted, and changing the presidential term to 7 years, up from 5. Bongo's critics accused him of intending to rule for life. On November 27, 2005, Bongo won a 7-year term as president, receiving 79.2% of the vote, comfortably ahead of his 4 challengers. He was sworn in for another 7-year term on January 19, 2006 and remained president until his death in 2009. Bongo converted to Islam and took the name Omar while on a visit to Libya in 1973. At the time, Muslims constituted a tiny minority of the native population. Following Bongo's conversion, the numbers grew, although they remained a small minority. He added Ondimba as a surname on November 15, 2003 in recognition of his father, Basile Ondimba, who died in 1942. Bongo's first marriage was to Louise Muyabi Makala. They had a daughter, Pascaline Bongo Ondimba, born at Franceville in 1957. Pascaline was Gabon's foreign minister and subsequently director of the presidential cabinet. Bongo's second marriage was to Marie Josephine Kama, later known as Josephine Bongo. He divorced her in 1987, after which she went on to launch a music career under a new name, Patience Dabani. They had a son, Alain Bernard Bongo, and a daughter, Albertine Emissa Bongo. Born at Brazzaville in 1959, Alain Bernard Bongo, later known as Ali Ben Bongo, served as foreign minister from 1989 to 1992, then as defense minister from 1999 to 2009, and was then elected president in August 2009 to replace his father. Bongo then married Edith Lucy Sassou Nguesso, nearly 30 years his junior, in 1989. She was the daughter of Congolese President Denis Sassou Nguesso. She was a trained pediatrician, known for her commitment to fighting AIDS. She bore Bongo 2 children. Edith Lucy Bongo died on March 14, 2009, 4 days after her 45th birthday in Rabat, Morocco, where she had been undergoing treatment for several months. The statement announcing her death did not specify the cause of death or the nature of her illness. She had not appeared in public for around 3 years preceding her death. She was buried on March 22, 2009 in the family cemetery in the northern town of Adou, in her native Congo. In all, Bongo had more than 30 children with his wives and other women. On May 7, 2009, the Gabonese government announced that Bongo had temporarily suspended his official duties and taken time off to mourn his wife and rest in Spain. International media, however, reported that he was seriously ill, and undergoing treatment for cancer in hospital in Barcelona, Spain. The Gabonese government maintained that he was in Spain for a few days of rest following the intense emotional shock of his wife's death, but eventually admitted that he was in a Spanish clinic undergoing a medical checkup. On June 7, 2009, unconfirmed reports quoting French media and citing sources close to the French government reported that Bongo had died in Spain of complications from advanced cancer. The government of Gabon denied the reports, which had been picked up by numerous other news sources, and continued to insist that he was well. His death was eventually confirmed by Gabonese Prime Minister Jean-Yves Ndong, who said in a written statement that Bongo had died of a heart attack shortly before 12:30 GMT on June 8, 2009. Bongo's body was flown back to Gabon, where it lay in state for 5 days, as thousands of people came to pay their respects. A state funeral followed on June 16, 2009 in Libreville, which was attended by nearly 24 African heads of state, including several of the continent's strongmen who themselves had ruled for decades, and by the French President Nicolas Sarkozy and his predecessor Jacques Chirac, who were the only Western heads of state to attend. Bongo's body was then flown to Franceville, the main town in the southeastern province of Otagoua, where he was born, where he was buried in a private family burial on June 18, 2009. Thank you for watching this video.